The morning fog rolled across the Hudson River like a grey shroud, obscuring the Manhattan skyline from Valeria Reyes' apartment window in Washington Heights. She stood there, coffee growing cold in her hands, staring at the missing person flyer that had arrived in her mailbox the night before. Martin Chen's face looked back at her, young, idealistic, the kind of activist who still believed peaceful protest could change the world. He'd been missing for 3 weeks, and the NYPD had already moved his case to the back burner, labeling it as voluntary disappearance. Valeria knew better. In her 15 years as an investigative journalist covering human rights violations, first in Buenos Aires and now in New York, she'd learned to recognize the patterns, the sudden silence of social media accounts that had been active daily, the abandoned apartment with coffee still in the maker, the friends too frightened to talk. Martin hadn't disappeared. He'd been disappeared. Her phone buzzed with a text from her editor at the New York Independent. "Staff meeting in 20. Don't be late." Valeria grabbed her leather jacket, the same one she'd worn covering the protests in Plaza de Mayo years ago, and headed out into the chaos of morning Manhattan. The subway was packed with commuters, their faces buried in phones, oblivious to the fact that someone among them had vanished without a trace, and the city simply didn't care. The Independent's offices occupied the 15th floor of a building in Midtown, squeezed between a hedge fund and a tech startup, a perfect metaphor for journalism's precarious position in modern America. Her editor, James Morrison, was already holding court in the conference room, his voice carrying through the glass walls as he assigned stories about city council elections and restaurant openings. "Reyes, you're late," Morrison said as she entered. Though his tone was more resigned than angry, he knew her well enough to expect it. "What have you got for me this week?" "Martin Chen," Valeria said simply, placing the missing person flyer on the table. The room went quiet. Everyone knew Martin's name. He'd been the face of the recent protests against ICE detention centers, his speeches going viral on social media before his sudden disappearance. Morrison sighed, rubbing his temples. "Valeria, we've been through this. The police say he probably went underground, maybe back to family in California. There's no story here." "There's always a story when someone fighting the system suddenly vanishes," Valeria countered, her Argentine accent thickening with emotion. "Martin was about to testify before Congress about conditions in the detention centers. He had evidence, James, documents, recordings, and now he's gone. Even if that's true, we can't prove." "Since when do we wait for proof before investigating?" Valeria interrupted. "My father disappeared in 1978 from our home in Buenos Aires. The government said he'd fled to Uruguay. We found his body 10 years later in a mass grave. The patterns are the same, James. Different country, same playbook." The room was uncomfortable now. Her colleagues shifted in their seats, unsure how to respond to the parallel she was drawing. America wasn't supposed to be like the Argentina of the Dirty War, but Valeria had seen enough to know that every democracy carried within it the seeds of its own potential darkness. Morrison finally nodded. 1 week. You get 1 week to find something concrete. But Valeria, be careful. This isn't Buenos Aires in the 70s. If you start making accusations without evidence, I know the risks, she said, already gathering her things. I always have. That afternoon, Valeria sat in a Dominican cafe on 181st Street, across from Maria Santos, Martin's girlfriend. Maria's hands shook as she lifted her coffee cup, her eyes darting constantly to the door, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "He was scared," Maria said quietly. "The last week before he disappeared, he kept saying they were watching him, following him. He'd get calls in the middle of the night, just breathing. Then they'd hang up." "Did he tell you about the evidence he'd gathered?" Valeria asked, keeping her voice gentle. She recognized the trauma in Maria's eyes, had seen it countless times in the families of the disappeared. Maria nodded, pulling out a flash drive from her purse. "He gave me this the night before he vanished. Said if anything happened to him, I should find someone who wouldn't be afraid to use it. I've been too scared to even look at what's on it." Valeria pocketed the drive carefully. "Maria, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Family outside the city? My sister in Philadelphia, but I can't just leave. What if Martin comes back? The hope in her voice broke Valeria's heart. She'd heard that same hope in her mother's voice for years, even after they'd identified her father's remains. He'd want you to be safe. Go to your sister. I'll call you the moment I learn anything. Back in her apartment that evening, Valeria opened the flash drive with trembling fingers. What she found exceeded her worst fears. Martin had documented a shadow network operating within ICE, conducting unauthorized deportations and worse. There were photos of detained activists who'd supposedly been released, but whom no one had seen since. Financial records showing payments to private security firms with no official government contracts. And most damning, a recorded conversation between two officials discussing how to handle Martin before his congressional testimony. Valeria's blood ran cold as she recognized one of the voices. Deputy Director Robert Kane, a man who'd been lauded for his tough stance on immigration, was clearly heard saying, "The Chen problem needs to disappear. Make it clean. Make it look voluntary." She immediately made copies of everything, uploading files to secure cloud servers and sending encrypted copies to trusted contacts. She'd learned from her father's case. Never keep all the evidence in one place. As she worked, her apartment's intercom buzzed. The doorman's voice crackled through. "Miss Reyes, there are some gentlemen here from Homeland Security. They say they need to speak with you urgently." Valeria's heart raced. They'd moved faster than she'd expected. She grabbed her laptop and the original flash drive, shoving them into her bag. Her father had taught her to always have an exit strategy. The fire escape outside her bedroom window led to the alley behind the building. From there, she could disappear into the maze of Washington Heights, a neighborhood where people knew how to not see things when necessary. As she climbed out the window, she could hear footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Heavy footsteps, multiple sets. They weren't bothering to be subtle. That worried her more than if they'd tried to be sneaky. It meant they were confident, unafraid of consequences. It meant Martin Chen might not be the only one about to vanish without a trace. The abandoned warehouse in Queens had become Valeria's makeshift headquarters for the past 48 hours. She'd learned about it from Luis, an old contact from her days covering labor disputes, a place where undocumented workers would sometimes hide when raids were imminent. Now she sat hunched over her laptop, connected to the internet through a chain of VPNs, uploading Martin Chen's evidence piece by piece to WikiLeaks and every major news outlet she could trust. Her phone, one of several burners she'd purchased with cash, rang. It was James Morrison. "Valeria, what the hell have you done? There are federal agents camped outside our offices. They're saying you're in possession of classified materials, that you're a threat to national security." "The only threat is to their cover-up," Valeria replied, her fingers never stopping their work on the keyboard. "James, I'm sending you everything." Martin Chen documented a black site program, off-the-books detentions. People are being disappeared, just like during Argentina's dirty war. "This is America, Valeria. We have laws, oversight." "We have the illusion of oversight," she interrupted. "The same thing we had in Argentina before the coup. Everyone believed it couldn't happen until it did. Martin found proof that at least 12 activists have been grabbed in the last 6 months. They're being held in a private facility in New Jersey, run by a contractor called Prometheus Security." There was a long pause on the other end. "Jesus Christ, you're sure about this?" "I have recordings, documents, photos." Martin was thorough. He knew they'd come for him eventually. She paused, hearing a sound outside. "James, I have to go. Publish everything I send you. Don't wait." "Valeria!" She hung up and packed quickly. The warehouse had served its purpose, but staying in one place too long was dangerous. As she made her way to the exit, she nearly collided with someone coming in, Maria Santos, Martin's girlfriend, who should have been safely in Philadelphia. "Maria, what are you doing here?" Maria's face was tear-stained, her whole body trembling. "They have my sister. They took her last night. Said if I don't bring them the flash drive and you, they'll make her disappear too." Valeria's mind raced. This was escalating faster than she'd anticipated. "Maria, listen to me. The information is already out there. Taking me won't stop it." "I don't care about the information," Maria sobbed. "I just want my sister back. Please, Valeria, they said you'd understand. They said you'd do the same for your family." The words hit Valeria like a physical blow. They'd done their homework, knew about her father, her family's history. They were playing on her deepest trauma. But she also knew that surrendering wouldn't save Maria's sister. People who disappeared into this system didn't come back. "Maria, I need you to trust me. We're going to get your sister back, but not by giving them what they want. We're going to expose them so thoroughly that they'll have no choice but to release everyone." Before Maria could respond, the warehouse doors burst open. Men in tactical gear flooded in, red laser sights dancing across the walls. But these weren't federal agents. Their uniforms bore the Prometheus security logo. Private contractors operating outside official channels. "Ms. Reyes," a voice called out. Deputy Director Robert Kane stepped through the line of armed men, his face a mask of bureaucratic calm. "You've caused quite a stir. Time to end this." "The story's already out," Valeria said, standing straighter despite the weapons pointed at her. "Every major newspaper has it. You're finished." Kane smiled coldly. "You really don't understand how this works, do you? A few documents can be dismissed as forgeries. A hysterical journalist with a history of trauma can be discredited. Mental illness runs in families, doesn't it? Your mother never quite recovered from your father's disappearance." The casual cruelty of the statement made Valeria's blood boil. "Don't you dare!" "Oh, I dare. You see, Ms. Reyes, we've learned from the mistakes of past regimes. We don't need mass graves or military juntas. We have psychiatric holds, wellness checks that go wrong, tragic accidents, so much cleaner, so much more plausible." One of the contractors stepped forward with a syringe. Valeria recognized the setup. They'd drug her, stage a breakdown, discredit everything she'd uncovered. But she'd prepared for this possibility. Her hand moved to her pocket where she'd hidden a small device, a live streaming camera connected directly to her newspaper's Facebook page. "Smile, Director Kane," she said, pulling out the device. "You're live. 50,000 viewers and climbing." Kane's face went pale as he realized his entire confession was being broadcast. The contractors looked to him for orders, uncertainty creeping into their positions. In that moment of hesitation, sirens became audible in the distance, lots of them. "That would be the real FBI," Valeria said, "the ones who still believe in the law. James Morrison may be many things, but he has connections. And unlike you, some people in Washington still have consciences." The tactical team began to withdraw, Kane backing toward the exit. "This isn't over, Reyes. You have no idea how deep this goes." "Deep enough that you're scared," she replied. "Deep enough that you're running." As Kane and his team fled, Valeria turned to Maria, who had collapsed to the floor in shock and relief. The FBI agents who arrived moments later were led by Special Agent Diana Walsh, someone Valeria had heard about, a straight shooter who'd been investigating irregularities in ICE operations for months. "Ms. Reyes," Agent Walsh said, "we're going to need everything you have, and we'll need you to testify. First, we need to find the detention facility in New Jersey," Valeria said urgently. "There are people there, including Martin Chen and Maria's sister." Walsh nodded, already coordinating with her team. "We have the location from your documents. Teams are en route now." As they waited for news, Valeria sat with Maria in the back of an FBI vehicle, watching the live stream views climb past 500,000. Comments poured in from around the world, many from families whose loved ones had also vanished without explanation. The story was becoming bigger than just Martin Chen. It was exposing a system that had operated in shadow for who knew how long. Her phone rang. It was her mother calling from Buenos Aires. "Mija, I saw the video. You're being so brave, just like your father." "Mama, I'm scared," Valeria admitted, something she rarely did. "Good. Fear keeps you careful. But remember what we learned. The only thing worse than fear is silence. Your father knew that. Now the whole world is watching. They can't make you disappear when everyone is looking. 2 hours later, Agent Walsh returned with news that made Valeria's knees weak with relief. We found them. 17 detainees, including Martin Chen. He's dehydrated and traumatized, but alive. Maria's sister, too. The warehouse that had felt like a trap just hours earlier now felt like a monument to possibility. Sometimes, Valeria thought, David really could defeat Goliath, but she also knew this was just one battle in a longer war. Cain was still out there, and the system that had created him remained largely intact. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Cameras from every major news network focused on the witness table where Valeria sat beside Martin Chen. 3 weeks had passed since the raid on the New Jersey facility, and the reverberations were still being felt throughout Washington. 6 officials had been arrested, including Deputy Director Cain, though he'd been released on bail within hours. A reminder that justice and power often operated on different scales. Martin looked fragile but determined, his hands steady as he adjusted the microphone. The weeks of detention had left him 20 pounds lighter, with a tremor in his left hand that appeared whenever he was stressed. But his eyes burned with the same fire that had made him such an effective activist. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Homeland Security Committee, called the hearing to order. Mr. Chen, Ms. Reyes, thank you for your courage in bringing this matter to light. Mr. Chen, would you please describe your experience for the record? As Martin began his testimony, detailing the midnight abduction, the unmarked facility, the psychological torture designed to break him without leaving physical marks, Valeria scanned the room. She recognized several faces from Prometheus Security in the back rows, their presence a clear attempt at intimidation. But she also saw Maria Santos in the public gallery, holding her sister's hand, both women wearing white scarves, a symbol borrowed from the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, the Argentine women who demanded answers about their disappeared children. They told me I didn't exist anymore, Martin was saying, his voice growing stronger, that I had been erased from all databases, that my family had been told I'd fled the country. They said no one was looking for me. But someone was, Senator Williams noted, glancing at Valeria. Ms. Reyes never stopped, Martin confirmed, even when it put her own life at risk. When Valeria's turn came to testify, she didn't just talk about Martin's case. She presented the committee with evidence of a broader pattern, contracts between Prometheus Security and various government agencies, off-the-books facilities in 4 states, at least 30 more cases of suspicious disappearances that fit the same profile. What we've uncovered, she said, meeting the eyes of each committee member in turn, is not a few bad actors, but a systematic attempt to circumvent constitutional protections. This is not about immigration or national security. It's about silencing dissent. Senator Thomas Burke, known for his hardline stance on security issues, leaned forward. Ms. Reyes, you're not an American citizen. Some might say you have no standing to criticize our institutions. Valeria had expected this. Senator, I've seen what happens when democratic institutions fail. My father was disappeared by the Argentine military government in 1978. I was 8 years old. For 10 years, my mother and I searched for him, were told he'd abandoned us, that he'd fled the country. We found his remains in a mass grave in 1988. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I became an American resident because I believed this country was different. But democracy isn't about geography. It's about vigilance. The moment we stop questioning, stop investigating, stop demanding accountability, we begin the slide toward the very darkness America claims to stand against. The room was silent. Even Burke seemed momentarily chastened. But Valeria knew that moving speeches rarely changed policy. Real change came from sustained pressure, from refusing to let stories die. After the hearing, Valeria and Martin were ushered to a secure area where Agent Diana Walsh was waiting. You both did well, but I need to warn you. We've intercepted communications suggesting Prometheus isn't backing down. They're regrouping, destroying evidence. And Kane is using his connections to build a counter-narrative. What kind of counter-narrative? Martin asked. Walsh pulled out a tablet, showing them a series of social media posts and fringe news articles. They're painting you as a Chinese agent, Martin. And Valeria, they're digging into your family's history, trying to connect your father to leftist guerrilla groups. Valeria felt her stomach turn. Even in death, her father wasn't safe from those who would rewrite history. Let them try. The truth doesn't always win, Walsh interrupted gently. Not without help. I need you both to understand that testifying today was brave, but it also painted targets on your backs. We can offer protective custody. No! Valeria and Martin said almost simultaneously. Martin continued, hiding is what they want. Every day we're silent is a day they can spin their lies. That evening, Valeria sat in her temporary apartment. She couldn't return to her old one, not yet. James Morrison had arranged this place, a corporate rental used by the newspaper for visiting journalists. It was sterile, impersonal, but safe. She was reviewing the day's coverage when her secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a Buenos Aires number. Valeria? The voice was familiar but unexpected. Patricia Mendez, her mother's friend who worked at the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team, the group that had identified her father's remains. Patricia? How did you get this number? Your mother gave it to me. Valeria, I need to tell you something about your father's case. We've been digitizing old files and we found something. Your father wasn't just disappeared because of his union activities. He was investigating something called Operation Prometheus. Valeria's blood ran cold. That's impossible. Prometheus Security wasn't founded until 2010. The company wasn't, but the network behind it was. Your father found evidence of a collaboration between elements of the Argentine military and certain American intelligence assets. They were developing methods for soft disappearances, ways to remove dissidents without the international outcry that mass graves caused. The pieces were falling into place in Valeria's mind. They exported it. They took what they learned in Latin America and brought it here. More than that. Some of the same people are involved. I'm sending you encrypted files, but Valeria, be careful. If they realize you have this... After the call ended, Valeria sat in the darkness of the apartment, city lights painting patterns on the walls. Her investigation had started with one missing activist and had uncovered a transnational network, decades in the making. The weight of it was overwhelming, but also clarifying. This wasn't just about Martin Chen, or even about America. It was about a system that transcended borders, that had learned to evolve and adapt while maintaining its core purpose, the suppression of dissent. Her laptop chimed with Patricia's encrypted files. As she began to read, she found her father's handwritten notes, scanned and preserved. His writing was careful, methodical, documenting meetings and connections. One name appeared repeatedly, Robert Kane Sr. The current deputy director's father had been a CIA operative in Buenos Aires during the Dirty War. Valeria reached for her phone to call Agent Walsh, but stopped. Who could she really trust? How deep did these connections go? Outside, she could hear sirens in the distance, a normal sound in New York, but tonight it felt ominous. She made a decision that her father might have made in his final days. She would compile everything, Martin's evidence, her father's research, the Prometheus documents, into one comprehensive report. And she would release it simultaneously to every major news outlet in the world, making it too big to suppress, too widespread to discredit. As she began to write, she thought about Martin's words during his testimony. They told me I didn't exist anymore. But existence, Valeria had learned, wasn't just about official recognition. It was about truth, about memory, about refusing to be erased. Her father had existed, Martin existed, and all the disappeared existed in the determination of those who refused to stop looking for them. The Federal Correctional Institution in Otisville, New York, was considered one of the cushier federal prisons, the kind where white-collar criminals served their time. It was here, 6 months after the congressional hearings, that Valeria had come to interview Robert Kane. The former deputy director had been convicted on conspiracy charges, but received only 5 years, a slap on the wrist considering the scope of his crimes. The real perpetrators, the ones whose names appeared in her father's notes from the 1970s, remained untouchable, protected by classification stamps and statutes of limitations. Kane sat across from her in the visitors' room, looking oddly relaxed in his prison khakis. "I wondered when you'd come," he said, his voice carrying none of the venom from their warehouse confrontation, the crusading journalist needing the final piece of her story. "I came because I want to understand," Valeria replied, her recorder openly placed on the table between them. This was all on the record. "Your father was in Buenos Aires during the Dirty War. You grew up knowing what he did. How do you become that?" Kane leaned back, studying her with an expression that might have been respect. "My father believed he was saving Western civilization from communism. I believed I was saving America from chaos. Every generation thinks its threats are existential, Ms. Reyes. The methods evolve, but the fear remains the same. Fear of what? People like Martin Chen? Students and activists? Fear of change? Fear of losing control?" Kane's honesty was unexpected. "You want to know the truth? The program would have continued with or without me. There's always another Kane, another Prometheus, another facility. You cut off one head, and 2 more grow back," Valeria finished. "I've heard that before. It's what every criminal organization says to justify its existence." "Is it wrong if it's true?" Kane challenged. "You exposed our operation. Martin Chen is free, testifying, writing his book. You're a hero journalist. But right now, in some office building you'll never find, someone is designing Prometheus 2.0. Smarter, more subtle, completely legal on paper." Valeria wanted to argue, but she knew he wasn't entirely wrong. In the months since the exposé, she'd watched the initial outrage fade into resignation. The news cycle had moved on. The structures that had enabled the disappearances remained largely intact, just with new oversight committees and revised protocols that meant nothing to those with the will to circumvent them. "Why did you agree to see me?" she asked. Kane smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "Because I wanted to tell you something about your father." Valeria's breath caught. "You weren't even born when he died." "No, but my father kept detailed records. Professional habit." He leaned forward. "Alejandro Reyes wasn't just investigating Operation Prometheus. He was part of it initially. He was a liaison between the unions and what he thought were legitimate government representatives. When he realized what was really happening, he tried to expose it. That's why they had to disappear him. He knew too much from the inside." The room seemed to spin around Valeria. Her father, a collaborator? Even unwittingly? "You're lying. Room 4, Box 17 in the National Archives, declassified just last month. Your father's signature is on the initial cooperation agreements. He thought he was preventing violence by facilitating dialogue. Instead, he was identifying targets." Kane's voice held something like sympathy. "The truth you seek isn't always the truth you want, Ms. Reyes." That evening, Valeria stood in her New York apartment, her real one, which she'd finally returned to after months of safe houses and security details. Martin Chen's book had been published to great acclaim, and he'd started a foundation for families of the disappeared. Maria Santos worked there now, helping other families navigate the bureaucracy of loss. The official narrative was one of triumph. Corruption exposed, justice served, democracy preserved. But Valeria knew better. She'd visited the National Archives that afternoon, had seen her father's signature on those documents. The idealistic young union organizer, trying to prevent violence through cooperation, had unknowingly facilitated the very system that would consume him. The truth was messier than martyrdom, more complex than simple heroism. Her phone rang. It was her mother in Buenos Aires. "Mija, you sound tired." "Mama, I need to ask you something about Papa." There was a pause. You found out about the early days. So her mother had known. Why didn't you tell me? Because it would have changed nothing except how you remembered him. Your father died trying to make amends for his mistakes. Isn't that what matters? After the call, Valeria sat at her laptop, cursor blinking on a blank page. She'd planned to write the definitive account of the Prometheus scandal, but now she wasn't sure what story to tell. The simple narrative of good versus evil had dissolved into something more troubling. A system where everyone was compromised to some degree, where even the victims could become unwitting perpetrators. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Diana Walsh, the FBI agent who'd become something like a friend through all of this. "We have a problem," Walsh said as soon as Valeria let her in. "There's been another disappearance. Different state, different agency, but the same pattern." Valeria felt exhausted. So Kane was right. It never ends. "It ends when we stop fighting," Walsh countered. "Look, I know you're tired. I know the truth about your father has shaken you. But that's exactly why we need people like you. People who understand that the world isn't black and white, but are still willing to stand in the grey areas and demand better. And if I become like my father? If I make compromises that enable the very thing I'm fighting?" Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Then you hope someone like your daughter will hold you accountable." Valeria didn't have a daughter, might never have one given the life she'd chosen. But she understood what Walsh meant. Accountability was generational, a torch passed between those who refused to accept the unacceptable. She turned back to her laptop and began to write. Not the simple story of heroism she'd originally envisioned, but something more complex and perhaps more necessary. A story about how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil, and how the only defense against systemic injustice is perpetual vigilance, even when that vigilance reveals uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Outside her window, New York hummed with its usual energy. 8 million people living their lives, most unaware of the shadows that operated just beyond their perception. But some knew, some watched, some remembered. And as long as they did, the disappeared would never be fully erased. Martin Chen called as she was finishing her first draft. "Did you see the news? They're forming a permanent commission on detention oversight. They want me to testify again." "Will you?" Valeria asked, though she knew the answer. "Every time they ask, as many times as it takes. That's what we do, right? We keep telling the story until someone listens." After the call, Valeria looked at the photo on her desk. Her father, young and idealistic, unaware of the tragedy that awaited him. She'd had it reframed recently, adding a small plaque with a quote from an Argentine poet. "In the struggle between memory and forgetting, choose memory, always memory, even when it hurts." The Prometheus scandal would fade from public consciousness, she knew. Kane would serve his time and emerge to a comfortable consulting job. The systems would adapt and evolve, but the work would continue, one story at a time, one disappeared person at a time, one truth at a time. It wasn't victory in any traditional sense, but in the space between vanishing and justice, it was enough to keep the light burning. As she prepared to send her article to James Morrison, Valeria added a final line. "For my father, Alejandro Reyes, who was lost and found, who was wrong and tried to be right, who disappeared but will never be erased. And for all those still vanishing, still waiting for justice that may never come but must always be demanded." The city lights sparkled beyond her window, each one a life, a story, a potential injustice or act of courage. Valeria saved her document, backed it up in multiple locations, a habit she'd never lose, and began researching the new disappearance Walsh had mentioned. The work continued, it always would. That was both the burden and the gift of those who refused to let the disappeared vanish without a trace.